The first lie that morning was the smile on Graham Voss's face. It was the kind of smile executives wear when they think the room already belongs to them. Calm, easy, expensive. He stood at the front of the boardroom with one hand resting on the edge of the screen, a $720 million acquisition deck glowing behind him, while 12 directors pretended they were looking at numbers instead of the future payout in their heads. Outside the glass wall, San Francisco was gray and cold. Inside, everything was polished enough to reflect power back at itself. The walnut table, the filtered water, the dark suits, the silence that only exists when people are waiting to be told they're about to get richer. I was halfway down the left side of the table, a printed copy of the deck open in front of me, a yellow tab fixed to page 43. My name is Dr. Elena Marlowe Reed. I was 41 that spring, and I had spent the last 11 years turning a fragile battery safety invention into the reason Orison Thermal Systems was worth buying at all. I was Senior Vice President of Platform Architecture and IP Strategy, which was the formal way of saying I built the thing investors bragged about and panicked over in the same breath. I wasn't flashy. I didn't do theater. When something needed to survive lawyers, customers, regulators, and reality, it came through me. Graham knew that better than anyone, which is why what he did next was not careless. It was deliberate. He clicked to the slide labeled Core Asset Protection, then started walking the board through Northreach Energy's final concerns before signing. His voice was smooth and confident. At closing, he said, Northreach acquires full operational control of the Orison platform, including the underlying thermal barrier patent family that secures our safety moat. I looked down at page 43 again just to make sure I was seeing it right. Then I lifted my head and said, very evenly, "That sentence is not correct." The room shifted, not loudly, just enough. A few eyes moved off the screen. One director leaned back. Graham paused, then smiled like I had interrupted him to ask where the restroom was. "Elena," he said, "if this is another formatting issue, legal has already cleared the deck." "It's not a formatting issue," I said. "The company has an exclusive operating license. That slide states ownership as if the patent family sits fully inside Orison. It doesn't." There was a beat of silence. The kind that makes honest people nervous and dishonest people annoyed. Graham gave a small laugh and looked around the table. "This," he said, "is exactly what happens when you put scientists too close to transaction language. We get anxiety over paperwork." A couple of people smiled because he was the CEO and they were cowards. I did not move. He went on like I hadn't just challenged the legal foundation of the deal. "The asset is controlled," he said. "That is what matters. Northreach is buying a company, not a filing cabinet." Then he decided humiliation alone wasn't enough. He clicked to the next slide and said, "On integration leadership, we've made one final adjustment. After close, Elena will transition out of direct transaction authority. Licensing, technical transition, young and cross-functional integration will move to Ben Latham." Ben was 32, smart in the way polished young executives often are, and 3 years earlier he had needed me to explain the difference between thermal containment and thermal delay with a whiteboard marker in my hand. Now he sat 2 chairs away in a new suit, trying very hard to look surprised and failing. Graham kept going. "Her retention package has been restructured to reflect the new reporting model. Access to the deal room will narrow by end of day so the integration team can move cleanly." It was so clean, so polished, so public. No warning, no private conversation, no chance to respond before the board. Just a joke, a demotion, and an erasure wrapped inside transaction language. One of the directors glanced at me with that soft, useless look people wear when they want credit for witnessing cruelty without paying the cost of stopping it. I folded my hands on top of the deck. If I had raised my voice, Graham would have gotten exactly what he wanted. A woman in a boardroom reacting emotionally while he stood there looking strategic. So I gave him nothing. Not anger, not panic, not even a correction. But inside, the room had already changed shape. Because the patent Graham had just mocked me over was not a small filing. It was the foundation under our entire valuation. The heat shield architecture that kept a single failed battery cell from cascading through an industrial storage unit was the reason customers trusted us, regulators tolerated us, and Northreach wanted us. And Orison did not own it the way Graham had just told the board it did. And I had invented the core barrier years before I joined Orison. Early counsel had built an exclusive license structure through my holding company, Reed Meridian IP LLC, because the company had been too weak, too early, and too underfunded to buy the patent family outright. That structure gave Orison broad rights to use the technology. It let them manufacture, sell, raise capital, and grow. But it came with conditions, royalty obligations, attribution terms. And one clause that mattered more than anything in that room right then: if the company was in breach, change of control rights did not move cleanly without my written consent. Graham either forgot that or thought success had made it irrelevant. He kept presenting. The board kept nodding. Ben kept sitting there with his little future folded neatly in front of him. And I said almost nothing for the rest of the meeting. That was the moment they misread me most badly. They thought silence meant shock. They thought stillness meant surrender. They thought pushing me out in front of the board had made me smaller. What it actually did was give me certainty. By the time the meeting ended, I knew two things. First, Graham had just made the board rely on a false statement right before a transaction that depended on clean IP ownership and truthful disclosure. Second, the patent gate under that $720 million deal still ran through me. By noon, they started removing me in pieces. That was the part I almost respected. Not because it was honest, because it was organized. When I stepped off the executive elevator, my badge stopped opening the strategy corridor on the 7th floor. It still let me into my own office, but not the glass conference room where the acquisition team had been working for 6 straight weeks. My assistant, Nora, wasn't at her desk. Her keyboard was gone. Her framed photo was gone too. In her place sat a temporary facilities sign that read, "Workstation reassignment in progress." No one had told me. I opened my inbox and found a calendar invite titled Leadership Transition Alignment. It had been accepted on my behalf 23 minutes earlier. Ben was listed as owner. HR was included. So was IT. I was optional. That almost made me laugh. Almost. I walked into my office, closed the door, and stood there for a moment with my hand still on the handle. The room looked the same. The low bookshelf, the 2 prototype cells in acrylic display cases, the city beyond the windows. But the air had changed. The companies have a way of telling you your importance is permanent right up until the hour they decide it was administrative. I sat down and opened the transition memo. That was when the insult became strategy. My transaction bonus had been rolled into a severance-shaped retention package with a non-disparagement clause tucked into the back. My accelerated equity was smaller than what had been discussed with me 6 months earlier. The formal explanation was role realignment. The real meaning was simpler. They wanted my silence priced in before I had time to understand what they were doing. Ben was being granted authority over patent integration, customer continuity, and technical certification. On paper, it looked clean. In reality, it was absurd. And he had never handled any of those systems without me correcting the risk assumptions after the meeting ended. Then I found the wording that mattered most. In the internal acquisition summary, the core thermal barrier was described as company-originated platform IP, not licensed, not inventor-controlled, not subject to prior structure, company-originated. That phrase was not sloppy. It was a decision. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long time. I had given Orison 11 years. I was there when investors looked at our early prototypes like they were watching a fire hazard pretend to be a company. I sat through failed tests, shipping delays, regulator questions, supplier collapses, and every industry headline that made customers afraid to store energy at scale. While I took something delicate and frightening and made it defensible, I built trust one brutal quarter at a time. Now they wanted 3 things at once: my work, my credibility, and my disappearance. That combination told me this was bigger than a demotion. So I stopped reading what they were saying about me and started reading what they were trying to hide. I pulled the old license ledger from a locked folder I kept off the main finance share. Years ago, after one ugly audit scare, I had learned to keep my own clean copies of anything that could someday matter. I opened the royalty schedules, then the field of use expansion addendum, and there it was. A quarterly true-up payment tied to expanded commercial deployment had never been made. On a balance sheet next to a $720 million acquisition, the number looked small, something a careless executive might call rounding error. Legally, it was not small. If Orison had expanded the licensed technology into new deployment classes without completing that payment, the license was in breach. And if the license was in breach, certain transfer rights did not move automatically in a change of control transaction. I read the ledger twice, then a third time. The humiliation from the boardroom did not disappear. It just hardened into something useful. Graham had tried to turn me into a dismissed technical woman clinging to paperwork. Fine. Paperwork it was. I opened a blank document and started building a timeline. Board meeting, false ownership statement, role removal, access restrictions, rewritten internal summary, unpaid royalty true-up. That was the moment my anger changed shape. While I was no longer asking whether they had betrayed me, I was asking how far they had already gone on the assumption that I would do nothing. The first time I built the thermal barrier, Orison did not exist. That mattered more than anyone in that boardroom wanted to admit. I had been consulting for grid storage manufacturers back then, working long hours in labs that smelled like heated metal, coolant, and bad funding decisions. The whole industry had the same fear. Energy storage was profitable right up until a single damaged cell turned an entire unit into a controlled disaster. Everyone wanted density. Everyone wanted speed. Nobody wanted the headlines that came after a thermal cascade. What I built was not glamorous. Though it was a layered containment architecture that slowed heat transfer fast enough to stop one failing cell from taking the entire pack with it. Not perfect. Not magical, just real. Real enough that people who had spent years pretending the problem was manageable suddenly started calling me back. When Orison formed, they did not have the money to buy the patent family cleanly. They barely had enough money to survive payroll and pilot manufacturing. So outside counsel suggested a structure that kept the company alive without killing the invention. I licensed the patent family through my own holding company, Reed Meridian IP LLC. Orison got exclusive operating rights. They could build around it, sell it, scale it, and raise money with it. But exclusive use was not the same as ownership. That difference is easy to blur when business is booming. It gets much harder to blur when someone is trying to sell the company for $720 million. I pulled the executed license agreement from my private archive and laid it next to the newer merger documents. The contrast was almost insulting in its simplicity. The old agreement was careful, specific, honest. It named the patent family, defined the fields of use, listed the royalty structure, and spelled out the company's option to buy the patents outright later if it met the required milestones and paid the agreed price. Graham never completed that purchase. He delayed it twice during cash fights, once during a financing round, and once again when he decided it was easier to treat the structure as background noise than fix it properly. Success made him lazy, or maybe it made him arrogant. In executives like Graham, those two things usually travel together. The more I read, the clearer the mechanics became. Orison had broad rights, yes, but it also had obligations. Royalty true-ups if the technology expanded into new commercial uses, attribution requirements, written notice duties. And the clause I had felt like a pulse in the back of my mind from the second Graham mocked me in the boardroom. If the company was an uncured breach, no change of control transfer could rely on clean consent assumptions. In plain English, that meant Northreach was not just buying factories, engineers, customer contracts, and a polished slide deck. They were buying the legal right to say they controlled the safety architecture under the company's value. If that chain was dirty, incomplete, or disputed, the whole deal became dangerous. Not awkward. Dangerous. Defective transfer rights in an acquisition do not create neat little problems. They create frozen financing, bigger escrows, delayed approvals, shareholder anger, and lawyers who suddenly stop speaking in friendly tones. Then I found the email. It was 6 years old, sent during a smaller licensing discussion that never closed. Graham had written to the former board chair, Judith Harlan, "Elena's patent is the crown lock on the whole platform. We cannot trigger a transfer event without keeping her side clean." I read that line twice, then once more. That sentence did not just prove he knew the structure, it proved he had known it in language even a board director could understand. By the time I closed the file, the story had changed. I was no longer a pushed-out executive nursing a grudge. I was the inventor holding a signed agreement, an uncured breach, and written proof that the man trying to erase me had understood the risk all along. Once I understood exactly what they had done, I stopped acting like an employee and started acting like a counterparty. That distinction mattered. Employees complain. Counterparties document. I did not storm into HR. I did not send late-night emails full of rage. I did not confront Graham in a hallway and hand him the emotional reaction he was probably waiting for. Men like him are comfortable with anger. They know how to label it, contain it, and forward it to legal. What they fear is a quiet woman building a clean record. So I hired 2 lawyers. The first was a patent litigator named Naomi Sayer, who had the rare gift of explaining technical ownership to judges without making them hate her. And the second was an M&A lawyer named Victor Chen, who had spent 20 years around transactions and had the tired eyes of a man who had watched too many executives confuse confidence with disclosure compliance. When we met, I gave them one instruction. "No theater," I said. "No bluffing. No move we can't defend line by line." Naomi nodded once. Victor asked for the full paper trail. That was when I knew I had the right team. Over the next 2 days, I built the file in sequence, dated lab notebooks, early prototype photos, invention disclosures with timestamps predating my employment agreement, the exclusive license from Reed Meridian IPLLC, the royalty schedules, the field expansion addendum, board decks, financing memos, the unused purchase option Graham had never exercised, then the newer merger materials, including the ones now describing the thermal barrier as if it had always belonged to Orison in the cleanest possible sense. I added the 6-year-old email where Graham called my patent the crown lock on the whole platform. That one went into a separate folder labeled Knowledge and Notice. Then I created a timeline, not a dramatic one, a useful one. Every meeting, every document revision, every version of the transaction language that moved from licensed control to implied ownership, every time someone knew enough to fix it and chose not to. To tighten the record, I sent a short internal note to finance. Just 6 lines. Polite, dry, easy to underestimate. I asked for confirmation that the most recent field of use royalty true-up had been made under the license agreement tied to the thermal barrier patent family. Now I copied no one dramatic. Not Graham, not the board, just the finance controller and the associate general counsel responsible for commercial obligations. I already knew the answer. What I wanted was their silence. Because silence around a direct compliance question can become evidence later in ways panic never can. Timing was the next problem. Send a breach notice too early, and Graham would have room to cure, spin, or hide. Send it too late, and I would look opportunistic, like I had waited until maximum damage purely for leverage. I needed the exact point where truth would hurt most and still look disciplined. That point was certification. The moment outside counsel and financing parties needed to say, in substance, that Orison had the rights it claimed to transfer. So Naomi and Victor drafted 2 notices. One to Orison, one to transaction counsel. Clear language, no threats, just facts. The license was in uncured breach. Change of control consent had not been granted, and any representation of unrestricted ownership or transfer authority over the patent family was inaccurate under the existing agreements. I did one other thing before we sent anything. I called Judith Harlan. She had stepped off the board the year before, but she still understood the company better than half the directors combined. She answered on the second ring. I told her I was not asking for intervention. I was not asking for loyalty. I was telling her that if the board wanted the truth soon, I would have it in writing, in order, and impossible to misread. There was a long pause. Then Judith said, I was wondering how long it would take before someone remembered who actually built the lock. That call did not save me. It did something better. It planted a witness before the fire started. By the end of that week, the notices were ready. The record was clean. The trap was built. All that remained was the moment to close it. Once people decide you are finished, they stop hiding what they really think of you. That was the strange gift Graham gave me after the board meeting. He did not just push me out. He pushed me out too early. The next Monday, he held an all-hands meeting in the manufacturing atrium, the one with the polished concrete floors and the giant prototype unit near the staircase that had never worked as well as the smaller systems, but looked impressive enough for visitors. And I stood near the back beside 2 engineers from reliability testing. Neither of them knew yet whether I was leaving, staying, or being quietly dismantled in place. At Orison, people usually learn the truth by reading body language before they read memos. Graham stepped onto the small stage like a man already spending acquisition money in his head. He thanked the teams. He praised our discipline through scale. He told everyone Northreach saw Orison as the future of industrial storage safety. Then he started naming people. Operations, commercial, finance, Ben of course, always Ben. A next-generation leader, Graham called him, a steady hand for integration. He skipped me completely, not by accident, not because he forgot. He skipped me the way a person steps around a stain they expect housekeeping to handle. A few heads turned in my direction. Nobody said anything. That was office politics at its purest. Silent recognition with no public risk. I stayed still and let him keep talking. By then, I had started seeing the pattern more clearly. Graham was not merely removing me from the deal. He was trying to rewrite authorship before the paperwork hardened. If he could make enough people repeat the new version, then later, when questions came, he could claim memory confusion instead of deception. I saw the same tactic again in an investor prep deck Victor pulled from the data room. My original patent work had been reframed as a platform asset, iteratively developed under executive leadership. I actually smiled when I read that line. It was insulting, yes, but more than that, it was useful. Every false simplification made the eventual contradiction sharper. Then HR delivered the document that told me panic had already started beneath the surface. It arrived as a transition memo, harmless subject line, routine formatting, soft language about continuity and role alignment. But buried on page 4 was a paragraph broadening prior assignments, waiving approval rights, and confirming that all derivative patent value tied to the thermal barrier architecture belonged fully and irrevocably to Orison. That was not housekeeping. That was someone reaching for a bucket after smelling smoke. I read the paragraph twice, marked 3 phrases in yellow, and walked the memo down to HR myself. Melissa Crane, our head of people operations. Lon was sitting behind her glass desk with the careful face executives use when they want to look compassionate without becoming accountable. "I'm not signing this," I said. She gave me a tight smile. "It's standard transition language." "No," I said. "It's inconsistent with the existing agreements. If the company wants me to review new IP language, it can go through counsel." The word counsel landed exactly the way I wanted it to. Melissa's expression changed for half a second. Not fear, recognition. She knew there was a hole. She just did not know how deep it was. Graham, meanwhile, grew louder. He promised Northreach clean integration. He promised clean title. He promised no disruption. He also started telling board members that I had become difficult since being moved out of the transaction spotlight. Now I heard that through 2 separate channels, which meant he was workshopping the defense already. If anything exploded, he wanted the story to be about my wounded ego, not his false disclosures. That was fine with me. People only reach for character attacks when the paperwork is turning against them. By Thursday evening, Naomi and Victor finalized the notice package. At nearly the same moment, Orison's outside deal counsel sent a request for final ownership support documents to prepare for closing certification. Graham thought he was days away from cashing in. He had no idea he was about to certify a transaction on top of a patent structure he had already misdescribed too many times to walk back cleanly. We sent the notice at 8:12 on Friday morning, not early enough to look theatrical, not late enough to be ignored. Victor sent it to Orison's general counsel, outside deal counsel, and Northreach's transaction lawyers in the same minute. Naomi attached the supporting schedule references. The language was precise and almost cold in its restraint. Under the governing license agreement, Orison was in uncured breach due to the unpaid field expansion royalty true-up. Change of control consent had not been granted. Any representation of unrestricted ownership or transfer authority over the thermal barrier patent family was disputed by the patent holder and named inventor. No threats, no shouting, no dramatic adjectives. Just facts placed in the only room that mattered. The reaction began before anyone admitted what was happening. At 8:19, Finance requested an urgent document call. At 8:27, outside counsel asked for the full chain of title, all assignment schedules, royalty records, and every board reference tied to inventor consent. At 8:41, Northreach wanted confirmation that no other side letters or carve-outs existed beyond the license already disclosed. That question told me everything. They had stopped assuming the problem was containable. By 10 o'clock, the executive floor felt different. Not loud. Worse than loud. Controlled panic, doors closing, assistants whispering, people walking too fast while trying not to look like they were walking too fast. I passed Ben near legal, and for the first time since the board meeting, he did not try to meet my eyes. He looked like a man who had just realized his promotion might have been built on someone else's lie. Then Graham called me directly. His voice came in soft at first. "Elena, and I think we need to be practical." That was how men like him always opened when force had not worked yet, but dignity still had. He offered accelerated equity, cash, a formal consulting title after close. He said we could clean up the old structure and preserve shareholder value if I signed a retroactive consent and let counsel align the language. I won't sign something false, I said. His tone hardened. You are interfering with a board-approved transaction. No, I said. I'm interfering with a false certification. Silence. Then he tried the third version, the one built for future witnesses. This doesn't have to become emotional. I nearly laughed. He was the one who had mocked me in front of the board, the one who had cut my access, rewritten authorship, and tried to bury a consent problem under transition language. But now, because the paperwork had turned on him, he wanted the record to suggest I was a bruised executive lashing out over hurt feelings. The problem for Graham was that documents do not blush. They do not overreact. They do not care who sounds calmer on a call. By afternoon, the financial consequences started showing up in numbers. Northreach's team floated a much larger escrow holdback. The lenders paused final assumptions. Orison's CFO wanted cure options immediately. The general counsel wanted a defensible timeline of who knew what and when. One private equity director asked a question that moved through the building like a draft under a door. Why was the board told the IP was clean? That was the moment the truth became larger than me. I told Victor and Naomi the same thing I had known from the start, and I was not trying to burn the company down. There was still one honest path left. Cure the breach, correct the record, disclose the defect, negotiate properly. But honesty would expose Graham's lie, and Graham had built his entire authority on the belief that he could outtalk the truth. By the end of the day, nobody had used the word freeze. They did not need to. The acquisition had already stopped moving. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Monday at 6:30 p.m. Same room, same glass walls, same polished walnut table, same city fading blue behind it. But this time, nobody was smiling. When I stepped inside, the room did not react the way it had reacted a week earlier. No indulgent glances, no quiet amusement, no executive patience reserved for difficult technical people. The mood had changed from confidence to exposure. Folders were open. Outside counsel was present in person. Northreach's transaction lead and their lead lawyer were on the main screen from Houston. Even the directors who usually treated technical issues like weather had that careful stillness people get when they realize the problem is not going away because they are bored by it. Graham was already there. He looked rested in the artificial way powerful men do when they have spent the weekend trying to keep control with no sleep and too much coffee. His jaw was tight. Ben was not in the room. Neither was Melissa from HR. The circle had narrowed. That told me the damage was finally real. I took my seat, set a slim black folder in front of me, and waited. The lead independent director, Alan Pierce, cleared his throat and said, "This special session has been called to address the IP transfer dispute affecting the Northreach transaction." Dispute. That word was doing a lot of work. Graham turned slightly toward me. "Before we overreact," he said, "I want to note for the board that this is a curable technical issue being elevated at an unfortunate time." I looked at him and said nothing. He still thought framing would save him. Alan gestured toward me. "Dr. Reed, we're here because your counsel has challenged the company's right to transfer certain core patent assets under current deal terms. We need clarity." I opened the folder. For a second, I felt the strange calm that sometimes comes before something breaks cleanly in your favor. Not excitement, not revenge, just alignment. The kind that happens when the facts are finally in the room with the people who spent too long avoiding them. "My name is Dr. Elena Marlowe Reed," I said, looking around the table. I'm the inventor of the thermal barrier architecture underlying the Orison platform, and the managing member of Reed Meridian IP LLC, which holds the patent family currently described in your merger materials as fully company-owned and unrestricted. That description is false. No one interrupted. I started with the simplest thing first, the invention timeline. I walked them through the dated lab notebooks, the prototype photos, the disclosure forms, and the filing dates that all predated my employment at Orison. Then I handed around copies of the exclusive license agreement. Not a summary, the actual executed agreement. Tabs marked, definitions highlighted, change of control language flagged. I kept my voice even. Orison received broad exclusive operating rights. It did not receive automatic full ownership. The company also accepted obligations under this agreement, including royalty true-ups tied to field of use expansion. One of those payments was not made. That created an uncured breach. Northreach's lawyer leaned toward the camera. "Do you have documentary support for that statement?" Victor answered from the far end of the table. "Yes, it was included in Friday's notice package, along with the ledger history and payment schedule." Graham moved then. He leaned forward, folding one hand over the other like calm could still be manufactured. "The company has significantly improved the platform since Dr. Reed's original work. A later development weakens any suggestion that she can hold this transaction hostage over legacy filings." That was his first defense. Dilution through later progress. Naomi spoke before I had to. "Subsequent improvements do not erase chain of title issues on foundational patents, especially when those patents are still being used as a valuation anchor in transaction materials." I slid one more page across the table. Graham's own email, 6 years old, short, clear, impossible to explain away. "Elena's patent is the crown lock on the whole platform. We cannot trigger a transfer event without keeping her side clean. No one needed me to dramatize it. The room did that for me." Alan read it once, then again. One of the directors quietly removed his glasses. Another stopped looking at Graham and started looking at the table. Graham tried his second defense. "Even if the payment timing created a temporary issue, it's curable. That doesn't justify this level of disruption." Northreach's transaction lead answered that one herself. "It does from our side. We cannot close a transaction where title, consent rights, and prior disclosure accuracy are all in question at once." That sentence changed the room, because once the buyer said it plainly, this stopped being Graham versus me. It became Graham versus the deal. He turned to the board one last time and reached for the only argument he had left. "This is retaliatory," he said. "I reassigned Elena from integration leadership, and suddenly we have a crisis. The timing speaks for itself." I looked straight at him. "The timing does speak for itself," I said. You removed me after telling the board something you knew was not true. Then you narrowed my access, rewrote internal descriptions of the patent, and tried to get me to sign language that erased existing rights. This isn't retaliation, it's correction." Silence followed that. Real silence. Heavy silence. The kind that tells you the room has finally decided who the unstable one is. Outside counsel spoke next, carefully, like every word had already been revised in his head. "Based on the documents now before the board, prior transaction materials appear to have characterized the IP structure incompletely. That creates material process risk." Material process risk. That was lawyer language for "you have a serious problem, and the paper is bad." The directors did not look at me like I was inconvenient anymore. No, they looked at Graham like he had turned a payout into a liability event. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to form a special committee. Graham was removed from transaction leadership effective immediately. Ben's new authority over integration and IP transition was suspended. No further certifications would be issued to Northreach until the license issue, the disclosure problem, and the consent structure were addressed through independent review. A week earlier, Graham had mocked me in that room because he thought I was the easiest person there to cut out. That night, he left the boardroom without speaking to anyone at all, because now everyone in it knew I had been holding the only leverage that mattered. Once the board stopped protecting Graham, the truth moved fast. That is the thing about corporate lies. They can survive for years inside hierarchy, ego, and timing. But once the structure above them shifts, they collapse with embarrassing speed. The special committee took less than 3 weeks to do what the rest of the company had somehow failed to do for years. They pulled the disclosure trail, reviewed the royalty records, interviewed outside counsel, and reconstructed who knew the patent structure was incomplete when they knew it and what they did after that. The findings were not theatrical. They were worse. They were dry, organized, verifiable. Graham had pushed merger materials that overstated ownership certainty. He had kept moving after the breach risk surfaced. He had approved internal language that blurred licensed rights into implied company ownership. And when the problem threatened the transaction, he had tried to fix it with pressure, side language, and narrative control instead of honest disclosure. The general counsel resigned before the final report was issued. Ben disappeared from the transition chart 2 days later. Graham was terminated for cause the following Monday morning. The company announced it in one of those carefully worded internal emails designed to sound neutral while everybody reading it understands blood is on the floor. He was leaving effective immediately following a board-led governance review. No farewell note, no quote, no smiling photo from better quarters, just absence. I did not take victory laps. That would have made the whole thing smaller than it was. I met with the special committee through counsel and gave them the clean path forward, the same one I had offered before any of this needed to become public. Cure the breach, correct the record, restore proper inventor attribution, stop pretending the company owned what it had only licensed. If Orison still wanted the patent family purchased outright, then negotiate honestly and pay for it honestly. This time, they listened. The missed royalty true-up was paid. The transaction disclosures were rewritten. Internal materials were corrected. The board approved a direct patent purchase agreement between Orison and Reed Meridian, IPLLC, at a number that reflected what Graham had tried to treat as background paperwork. Northreach returned too, but not on the old terms. The new acquisition structure had tighter disclosures, a stronger escrow package, and enough caution in it to make clear they had learned exactly how close they came to buying a legal disaster in a polished deck. I stayed only as long as I needed to. That part mattered to me more than people expected. I did not want Graham's office. I did not want a heroic title. I did not want to spend the next 5 years serving directors who had only rediscovered my value after my leverage became expensive. I stayed long enough to protect the engineering team, stabilize the technical handoff, and make sure the final document said what should have been said from the beginning, that I built the core architecture, that the company's value rested on work they had tried to erase, that the deal only moved once the truth was put back into it. On my last day, I packed slowly, not because there was much to take, but because I wanted to leave without rushing. Nora, who had quietly returned to my team after the committee began its review, hugged me once in the doorway and said, "I think half this building forgot what you sound like when you stop letting people talk over you." I smiled at that. Then I walked down the same corridor outside the boardroom where Graham had once laughed at me in front of people who wanted my silence more than my work. His name was gone from the frosted glass beside the corner office, not covered. Not replaced yet. Just gone. That empty space was cleaner than any speech could have been. Months earlier, he had treated my patent like a technical detail and me like a woman he could remove from the frame before the big money arrived. In the end, the acquisition still happened. It just had to stop long enough for the truth to collect its price.